Hello and welcome to Radical Engagements here at Varn Blog. We are covering an article that I believe was first published in volume 86, number 9 of the monthly review in the first half of the Trump administration's first term. We're in a different term of since he's the only president to come back with an intervening term in about 100 years. It has happened before, but it's only happened once before. So we have to specify that. But in 2017, in Trump term, there's a lot of discussion about Marx on immigration. And I remember about 2 years later, for example, Angela Nagel using the quote, "We're going to actually talk about Marx on immigration, particularly in regards to the Irish," to argue for immigration restrictions, missing the larger part of Marx's point. Now, I'm going to have to deal with some stuff about actually existing socialist societies and immigration, but their reasoning was often quite different for restricting immigration than what we're talking about here, because obviously, if wages are set by the state, wage competition is not actually part of the reason why you are limiting immigration. It has to do with your productive capacity and your ability to absorb immigrants, and as well as fields of spies and other things. So even pretending that the thing that Marx is talking about is the same thing as why there's limited immigration in, say, the Soviet Union, it's not really about the same set of issues. Let's get into the piece. On April 9th, 1870, Karl Marx wrote a long letter to Siegfried Meyer and August Vogt, two of his collaborators in the United States. Now, VOGT is pronounced Vogt in German, but it's like Vogt in English because the G is more or less silent in both languages. And I'm not sure if we pronounce this name the Americanized way or the German way, but I'm going to go with the German way, kind of. In it, Marx touched on a number of subjects, but his main focus was on the Irish question. And this is the quote that gets included a lot, particularly the first part, including the effects of Irish immigration in England. The discussion seems to have been Marx's most extensive treatment of immigration. Marx doesn't talk a lot about it, frankly. And while it hardly represents a comprehensive analysis, it remains an interesting sample of Marx's thinking on the subject, at least on one day in 1870. And I agree with David L. Wilson on that. I mean, it's basically what we have from Marx on this topic. Given the intense and often bitter debates over immigration now taking place in the United States and Europe, the letter to Meyer and Vogt has received surprisingly little attention from the modern left. It was later on going to receive attention from people like Angela Nagel about 2 years after this article was written, but we'll come back to that. Immigrant rights advocates in particular have ignored Marx's thoughts on the issue, especially his remark, which reflects his assessment of how the capitalist system operates, that the influx of low-paid Irish immigrants to England forced wages down for native-born English workers, which was more or less true. In fact, many present-day supporters of immigrants' rights have taken the side of liberal economists who insisted that immigration actually boosts wages for native-born workers. There's no evidence that it boosts wages for native-born workers. It does boost GDP. All right. And I guess the question is, does GDP boost help all in society or just some in society? And I think it's pretty clear from my perspective that it's a fairly narrow band of people who benefit from GDP expansion, but nonetheless. In his 1870 letter, Marx charged the English policy towards Ireland was based chiefly on the economic interest of England's industrial capitalists and landed aristocracy. Just like I think our policy towards immigration, and both restrictive and not, is based on the interest of large food conglomerates, but that's just me. The English aristocracy and the bourgeoisie, who wrote, had a common interest turning Ireland into a mere pasture land, which provides the English market with meat and wool at the cheapest possible price. Like the United States does to all kinds of countries in Latin America. For the capitalists, this was also an interest in reducing the Irish population by eviction and forcible immigration to such a small number that English capital invested in land lease for farming, can function there with security. It has the same interest in clearing the estates of Ireland as it had in clearing the agricultural districts of England and Scotland. The 6,000 to 10,000 pound absentee landlord and other Irish revenues, which present flow annually to London, have also been taken into account. But then Marx went on, the English bourgeoisie also had much more important interest in the present economy of Ireland, the forced immigration of Irish workers to England. Long quote from Marx. Owing to the constantly increasing concentration of leaseholds, Ireland constantly sends her own surplus to the English labor market and thus forces down the wages and lowers the material and moral position of the English working class. And a lot of people end right there. And most important of all, every industrial and commercial center in England now possesses the working class divided into two hostile camps, the English proletariats and the Irish proletariats. You can think about the internal colony thesis in the United States, where you had the white and the black workers. But anyway, back to the text. Still in a long quote from Marx. The ordinary English worker hates the Irish worker as a competitor who lowers the standard of life. And it's a lot of working class concern in immigration today, particularly when times are bad or seem lean, or when people think GDP is mostly going to the top 1%, which it definitely fucking is. All right. In relation to the Irish worker, he regards himself as a mere capitalist of the ruling nation, and consequently, he becomes a tool of the English aristocrats and capitalists against Ireland, thus strengthening their dominion over himself. So the English worker starts to identify with the people who are using the Irish worker to undercut his wages. And we can see this kind of tension in the battles about H-1B visas between Elon Musk and Steve Bannon in the Trump administration. And we also know, and we know this from almost all right populists in the history of right populism, they concede to international capital eventually, even if they try to control it. He cherishes the religious, social, and national prejudices against the Irish worker. His attitude towards him is as much the same as the poor whites to the Negroes in the former slave states of the United States, of the USA. The Irishman pays him back with interest in his own money. He sees in the English worker both an accomplished and a stupid tool of the English rulers in Ireland. So we see here where there's a misrecognition from a natural alienation from the Irish worker from the English worker because of the way the Irish worker is used to suppress wages for the English worker. But what does Marx say about this? This antagonism is artificially kept alive and intensified by the press, the pulpit, the comic papers, and in short, by all the means at the disposal of the ruling classes. This antagonism is the secret of the impotence of the English working class, despite its organization. It is the secret by which the capitalist class maintains its power, and the latter is quite aware of this. So we don't see here a call for restricting immigration to make the English working class more self-sufficient, because really this is a battle between capital, of which having the proletariats alienated and pitted against each other only exacerbates. Marx wrote these passages nearly 150 years ago, and he was certainly not infallible. In the same letter, he suggested optimistically that the independence for Ireland may hasten the social revolution in England, which, obviously didn't happen. But a great deal of his analysis sounds remarkably contemporary. The parallels become obvious if we substitute the Caribbean basin countries for Ireland and the United States for England. Just as English policy devastated small-scale agriculture in Ireland, U.S. promoted neoliberal programs like the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, have uprooted small producers in Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean islands. And this in turn has driven millions of the displaced to seek work in the United States, particularly from Central America. Honestly, even though they come through Mexico, more immigrants today come from Central America than Mexico, despite even the cartel violence in Mexico. Mexico's economy is improving, and thus they're less likely to immigrate to the United States. Les deux. Okay. Once here, present-day immigrants are forced, like their Irish predecessors in England, into low-paying jobs and substandard living conditions, only to face hostility from native-born workers who view them as competitors, or even from other immigrants who have more established roots in the contemporary society, which I think is something we're going to see more and more of. Antagonism over this competition are further fueled by racial and ethnic prejudices kept artificially alive and intensified by the press, even the liberal press. But Marx also claimed that the Irish immigration drummed down wages for the English worker. Anti-immigrant forces in the United States make similar claims today. Does that put Marx on the side of people like Donald Trump and former Arizona Sheriff Joe Arpaio, like some people were going to claim 2 years from when this article was written? Economist finding on wages. The effects of immigration on wages is, in fact, a key point of the contention in the current debate over immigration in the United States, with natives routinely charging that immigration reduces pay for U.S.-born workers, and immigrants' rights activists countering that immigration has only a small negative effect on the wages for native-born, or even a positive effect. Both sides cite the work of academic economists. Take the nativists who quote George Barajas, a conservative Cuban-American professor at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. In 2013, Borjas wrote from 1990 to 2010, immigration probably reduced the annual earnings of the American worker by 1,396 in the short run. The impact varies across skill groups, with high school dropouts being the most negatively affected group. Immigrants' rights activists prefer to cite Giovanni Petri, a University of California Davis professor who argued in 2010 that the total immigration to the United States from 1990 to 2007 would be expected to bring about an increase of about $5,000 in yearly income of the average American worker in constant $2,005. That's a weird. Activists on the issue are naturally quick to cite academic studies to support their own position, but they are less eager to look under the hood and analyze how scholars arrived at these numbers. Calculating the effect of immigration on wages is a complicated undertaking. There are a variety of possible empirical approaches. One method tries to correlate with the minimum immigration over a given period. For example, many assume that stagnation in real wages since the 1970s is connected to an increase in immigration during the period. However, there are many other possible causes: the weakening of the labor movement, job losses due to automation and offshoring, and so on, and these are difficult to quantify. Short of discovering an alternative universe, there's simply no secure way to model what wages would have been in absence of immigration. So most of these projected numbers are basically bullshit. They bracket out what they want to bracket out and include what they want to include, which means you're going to have a wide variety of potential answers for the problem. And people should suspect this more when you get these hard numbers from academic papers, particularly when they're doing stuff like looking at contribution to overall GDP and just dividing it. Like, yeah, not going to work. Another empirical approach is to compare wage trends in different parts of the country. For example, if wages rise in one city as immigration increases there, while at the same time wages fall in another city experiencing immigration decline, then increased immigration may be a factor pushing wages up. The Economist theoretical models. To deal with the problem, Borjas and Petri supplement their empirical studies with models based on economic theory, principally in terms of supply and demand. When immigrants enter the workforce, they increase the supply of labor without immediately increasing the demand. The short-term result is a tendency for the wages to fall. Over time, the wages should stabilize, since new immigrants would also increase the demand for goods and services, again, over time, and therefore for labor. But these efforts vary across different sectors of the workforce with various different effects. And that's not what people are really responding to. People don't live and die by balance sheets, at least not in the way they experience the world. Back to text. Much of the immigration to the United States from 1970 to 2008 involved workers with little education and limited English proficiency, although the H-1B visa stuff is not about that, who sought manual jobs at a time when demand for such work was shrinking. The result was an oversupply of manual laborers who can then be expected to push wages down for native workers in the same job category. This is the basis for Borjas' argument that immigration reduces wages. And Perry and his collaborators refined the basic model of supply and demand using a principle they call complementarity. In their view, low-wage immigrants do not simply substitute for native-born workers. Given their lower English proficiency, the immigrants take jobs that require minimal communication skills, encouraging native-born workers to use their greater communication skills to move into higher-level jobs. Yeah, that's a big assumption, but anyway. For example, as Perry wrote in 2010, as young immigrants with low schooling levels take manually intensive construction jobs, the construction companies that employ them have opportunities to expand. This increases the demand for construction supervisors, coordinators, designers, and so on. Those who are occupations with greater communication intensity are typically staffed by U.S.-born workers who have moved away from manual construction jobs. This complementarity task specializes typically towards pushing U.S.-born workers towards better paying jobs, enhances the efficiency of production, and creates jobs. For Perry and his collaborators, a factor more than compensates for the effects of simple supply and demand. According to their models, an influx of low-wage immigrants will bring down wages slightly for less educated native-born workers and will depress wages significantly for other immigrant workers already in the country. That's actually important and explains some inter-immigrant tensions, by the way. However, Perry writes that the benefits to better educated U.S.-born workers outweigh the losses for the less educated. Yeah, this is one of those things where it's an aggregate being taken to paper over some real internal tensions and contradictions. Anyway, back to the text. According to Perry's calculations of the wrong one, the average worker's income goes up by 0.6 to 0.9% for each 1% increase in the immigrant population. What the economists miss. Yeah, what do they miss? I mean, usually most everything, because their models always hide something. Though they reach opposite conclusion, the analysis of both Borjas and Perry share a major defect. Their assumption that the only factors determining wage levels are labor supply and the demand in immigrant workers' education and skill levels. In the real world, of course, there are many other factors at work. Women and African Americans are paid less than white men, but this is not due to an excess supply of women and African Americans. Likewise, it is not because unionized workers are better educated that they earn more than their non-union counterparts. Cough, cough. In most industries, although not all. Most immigrant workers are people of color, and it's hard to imagine that racial discrimination does not affect how much they are paid. One way social scientists try to approach these questions is the Oaxaca blinder decomposition technique, a statistical method that analyzes the wage gap between different groups by identifying known factors that impact wage levels, such as education and skill levels, and teasing out unknown factors that may be attributed to discrimination. Using a Oaxaca blinder decomposition, a 2016 study found that for third-generation Mexican Americans, only 58.3% of a worker's wage level is explained by known factors as education and work experience. Discrimination remains still worse for people of African ancestry. For these workers, the known factors only account for 48.3% of the difference in wages. Academic economists also tend to ignore the world legal status can play in determining wage levels because people who are on workers' programs or whatever get paid sub-minimum wage, even though 1/3 of the country's immigrant workers, some 8.1 million as of 2012, are undocumented according to the Pew Research Center. These workers face an additional hurdle. They might be made illegal and as a result live under constant threat of persecution and deportation, and that can be used to suppress wages pretty strongly. Under U.S. law, undocumented workers enjoy most of the same rights as other workers, although they can be paid sub-minimum wage. Yet they do not have the right to be here. At any moment, an unauthorized immigrant can be detained in prison and slated for deportation. Fear hangs over every aspect of these workers' employment and of their lives in general. The threat of deportation is a weapon always available to the employers when unauthorized workers try to assert their rights, to ask for higher wages, report workplace violations, demand compensation for injuries on the job, or form a union. And by law, these workers have no access to unemployment insurance or any other part of the frayed social safety net, so they face significant hardship if they lose their current jobs. Going on strike is risky for most workers. For undocumented, it requires a special level of courage. At minimum. Is it possible then to qualify the wage penalty that the real lack of legal status imposes on undocumented workers? Several studies have dealt with this question, mostly using the Oaxaca blinder decomposition. Given the sheer number of variables, these studies have produced widely divergent estimates on wage disparity ranging from 6% to more than 20%. But they all agree the lack of legal status has a definite negative impact on immigrants' pay. I mean, no shit. And this effect operates without any reference to supply and demand, or Perry's complementarity. Even if there is no oversupply of low-wage workers, undocumented immigrants will still be paid appreciably less than their U.S.-born co-workers and less than immigrant workers with legal status. This inevitably produces a substantial downward pressure on wages for U.S.-born workers in the job category with high rates of participation by the undocumented. For example, a survey in 2005 found that unauthorized workers account for 36% of all installation workers and 25% of all roofers and drywall installers. Even if wage penalty for these workers is on the low side, say 6.5%, it undoubtedly depresses wages for other workers in these construction jobs. So yes, Virginia, they do suppress wages for people in the same job category, and that's important to just be honest about. Quit lying. Working class divided. Yep. Another factor that the Economist ignores, precisely the one Marx considered the most important of all, the way immigration can be used to create a working class divided between two hostile camps, or in the United States, like 5 hostile camps, who are often hostile to each other, by the way. It's not just like white workers versus workers of color. It's sometimes ADOS workers versus immigrants, and Puerto Ricans versus Chicanos, and. I've even seen stuff like Tongans versus Samoans here in Salt Lake. Marx may have exaggerated when he called the antagonism between the English and Irish the secret impotence of the English working class. And in the United States today, anti-immigrant prejudice is one of the only forces preventing the majority of the population from asserting their own strength. Racism against African Americans, along with sexism, homophobia, and many other prejudices, continue to play a historic role in keeping workers from uniting and organizing. But xenophobia is also a major factor, especially in periods where immigration rates are high, which they're not particularly right now, but they're not super low either. There may be no easy way to quantify these effects on wages, but we can find at least one striking example of how effective anti-immigration sentiment can be in turning labor movements against the interests of its members. The Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, IRCA, was the first time instituted fines for employers caught hiring unauthorized workers. Yeah, by the way, there used to just be no fines. According to the law supporters, these employee sanctions would reduce unauthorized immigration by cutting off immigrants' access to U.S. jobs. In reality, the sanctions simply provided another tool for the super exploitation of undocumented workers. The IRCA's documentation requirements provided pretext for workplace raids and pushed many undocumented workers into the underground economy, where they face still more challenges in defending their labor rights. Even legitimate employers may reduce payment to workers who are immigrants and therefore possibly undocumented to compensate for the risk of being fined, while others now routinely use subcontractors who assume that risk themselves and pay workers even less because you're adding yet another middleman. Responding to the anti-immigration feeling in its members' union, the AFL-CIO supported this anti-labor measure in the run-up to the IRCA. It was not until 2000 that the Labor Federation finally renounced the employer sanctions and came out to support the legalization for unauthorized workers. Fighting exploitation, not immigration. Marx did not elaborate on his reasons for writing that the Irish immigration reduced the English workers' wages. He implied the cause was an oversupply of manual labor. But his other statements indicate he considered the English xenophobia and the resulting antagonism amongst workers an even greater problem. The important point, however, is that he was not blaming lower wages on immigrants themselves. For him, the culprits were the colonial system that drove the Irish workers to England, being capitalists trying to lower the wage cost, which they are always trying to do, and the exploitation of these workers once they arrived. The same considerations apply in the U.S. today. The main difference is the addition of legal status as a factor in setting wages, the law that now make work illegal for millions of migrant workers. Immigrants' rights advocates may feel it expedient to cite academic economists like Perry, who downplay or deny the downward pressure exerted on wages by the exploitation of undocumented workers. It is not. I agree. As Columbia University economist Moshe Adler has noted, this approach does nothing to convince the many U.S. citizens who work in occupations with large numbers of undocumented immigrants and therefore know firsthand that the exploitation of immigrant works puts them in direct downward pressure on their own wages. Far from helping the movement, citing Perry only adds to those workers' distrust and resentment towards middle-class immigrants' rights advocates. 100%. I completely fucking agree. And we see this today. More importantly, this approach distracts attention from efforts to address the real issue, the root cause of immigration in the U.S. foreign policy, the super exploitation of immigrant workers, and the common interest of immigrant and native-born workers, because both are being exploited. In 2010, the Dignity Campaign and loose coalition of some 40 labor and immigrants' rights organizations proposed a comprehensive approach to it, emphasizing these issues. More recently, Senator Bernie Sanders' 2006 campaign platform took some steps in the same direction, while the Movement for Black Lives platform made important recommendations in the August 2016 for fighting injustice and systemic racism and immigration law. All this stuff has been swept under the rug, though, because most of these movements failed by 2020 and were recuperated and emptied out by Democrats, which is a lot of the problem with this kind of shit. The political climate has become especially favorable for organizing along these lines since the financial crisis of 2008. Not anymore, it isn't, but it was until about 2017. Paradoxically, even Trump's 2016 presidential campaign may have helped. It embodied the nativist right, but it also made a broad sector of the population more aware of racism underlying anti-immigration xenophobia. Asterisk, until Joe Biden normalized most of it because it got hard in his first couple of months of being president, allowing the right to move, further right. This is the problem reading an article from 2017 is it doesn't see where the future is going. In his 1870 letter, Marx described what he considered the overriding priority for labor organizing in England. To make the English workers realize for them the national emancipation of Ireland is not a question of abstract justice or humanitarian sentiment, but the first condition of their own social emancipation. Similarly, not making shit shitty in Central America and Mexico is going to be good for the U.S. working class. Now, that's not something that's just in their control, but it's something to notice. His closing words of advice to Meyer and Foote were similar. You have a wide field in America for work along the same lines. A coalition of German workers with Irish workers, and of course also with English and American workers who are prepared to accede to it, is the greatest achievement you can bring about now. This internationalist and craft-based perspective has lost none of its good sense in the century and a half since it was written. So we have to deal with a lot of people who go, well, immigrants contribute a lot to the economy and grow the economy, but who's benefiting from that growth? It's not the immigrants, and it's not the people who feel slighted by it. But we also have to ask ourselves, why are certain areas, like why is Elon Musk really big on H-1B visa stuff, and why is Vivek Ramaswamy on his side, while Bannon and the other national conservatives oppose it, although Bannon's lost that debate before and been betrayed by Trump before. I don't know why these people keep on jumping on the same demagogue, except that they feel they have no other choice. But nonetheless, here you are. When Marxists and other socialists start picking up anti-immigration rhetoric because of the historical nature of actually existing socialist states, you have to remember that that was not about wage labor costs, at least not in the USSR, where that stuff was set by state policy anyway. The issue was the ability to absorb the immigrants. And that was not just from outside the USSR, it's even from areas within the USSR to other areas. This is not to defend the USSR's policy or condemn it, it's just to explain that the logic is fundamentally different than the logic cited by Marx, and conflating the two is not going to help you very much. You don't live in a socialist society here, unless you have the weirdest definition of what socialism is. My issue is if you focus on this in terms of pretending that immigration is not a threat to certain fields of workers, are that we should be happy, that we have a bunch of low wage, sub minimum wage workers in agriculture, making it viable for Americans to get cheap consumer goods. You are advocating for the super exploitation of immigrants yourselves, as well as pissing off native born workers in the field. But you also realize that giving into the xenophobia that this promotes also makes people tools of different elements of the bourgeoisie, as we've seen by the use of these sentiments in this coalition, to then watch people make the other argument in other cases. Now, people will be like, oh, well, Bernie Sanders supported the restriction of H-1B visas. And honestly, H-1B visas are their own problem. They're fairly elite jobs between fairly elite people. The idea that American workers won't do them, I think, is insulting to American workers, and also are both on the bottom and top. But it's also pretty clear that this populism is being used by people to do a bait and switch. In fact, arguably on both sides. You want to fix the problem of immigration to the United States, you have to deal with the reasons why people are immigrating. Some of which is not in your control, but a lot of which is. You want to deal with getting better wages for the working class, you have to have people who can see themselves as having common interests and solidarity with each other. And that's a big demand in the United States, because that's not common even amongst people of the same race. But we should talk a lot more honestly about this stuff and not try to gaslight people on it one way or the other. Because as Marx says, often you're picking one side of the bourgeoisie against the other, and you are exacerbating tensions that make it easier to control the overall working class. That is all. Like and subscribe, hit the bell, and protect your peace.